I had been working for Mr. Langston for a little over 3 years, and in all that time, I never imagined myself getting involved in anything that could jeopardize my career. His daughter, Lila, was always around the office, but she was younger, in her mid-20s, fresh out of graduate school. We exchanged pleasantries when she visited, but that was it. Nothing more than polite smiles and brief conversations in the hallway. But recently, things had started to change. It was subtle at first. She lingered a little longer after our interactions, her eyes meeting mine in ways that made my pulse quicken, though I wasn't sure why. I tried to dismiss it, told myself it was just my imagination, but those moments began to pile up. Soon, it became hard to ignore. Lila was stunning. There was no denying that. She had her father's sharp intellect, but there was a softness about her that he lacked. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind that drew people in without demanding attention. And over time, I found myself watching her more closely, noticing the way her fingers tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the way her lips curled into a half-smile when something amused her. One afternoon, after an unusually stressful week at the office, Mr. Langston invited a few of us over to his house for a casual get-together. A chance to unwind, he said, nothing too formal. I hadn't expected Lila to be there, but when I walked through the door and saw her, my heart skipped a beat. She was dressed casually, her long hair cascading over her shoulders as she greeted everyone with a smile that seemed brighter than usual. Throughout the evening, I could feel her eyes on me. Every time I looked up, she was already watching, her gaze steady, unwavering. There was something in the way she looked at me that made my skin tingle, a tension that hung in the air between us, though no one else seemed to notice. At one point, after a few too many drinks, I decided to step outside to clear my head. The night air was cool, and I found myself wandering toward the garage, looking for a quiet place to collect my thoughts. The garage was spacious, filled with tools and equipment that Mr. Langston used for his weekend projects. I leaned against one of the workbenches, exhaling slowly as I tried to shake off the strange feeling that had been creeping up on me all night. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and I turned to see Lila standing in the doorway. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The soft glow of the light from the house cast a warm halo around her, making her look almost ethereal. "I thought I'd find you out here," she said, her voice soft but steady. I cleared my throat, suddenly feeling more nervous than I had in years. "Needed some fresh air," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. She took a step closer, the door clicking shut behind her, sealing us in the enclosed space. "I get it. Sometimes it's hard to breathe in there." Her words hung in the air, and I could feel the tension between us growing thicker, more tangible. There was something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before, an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, my heart pounding in my chest as she moved closer. "You've been avoiding me," she said quietly, her gaze never leaving mine. I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "I haven't been." "You have," she interrupted, taking another step toward me. "Ever since I started spending more time at the office." "You think I haven't noticed?" I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died on my lips. She was right. I had been avoiding her, though I hadn't realized it until now. The subtle glances, the lingering touches, the way my pulse quickened whenever she was near, it had all become too much, too dangerous. But now, standing in the garage with her, there was no escaping it. "Lila," I began, but she silenced me with a look. "Don't," she said softly, her voice filled with something I couldn't quite place. "You don't have to explain. I know." She was standing so close now that I could feel the warmth of her body, could smell the faint hint of her perfume. My heart was racing, my thoughts a tangled mess of desire and guilt. This was my boss's daughter. This was wrong. But as she reached out and placed her hand on my chest, I knew that I couldn't walk away.
"Not now."
"I know you feel it too," she whispered, her eyes searching mine. "This tension between us. It's been building for weeks." Her words sent a jolt through me, and before I could stop myself, I nodded. I do. She smiled then, a slow, knowing smile that made my breath catch in my throat. Then stop fighting it. Her words were a whisper, but they echoed loudly in the garage, cutting through the space between us. My mind screamed that this was a line I couldn't cross, a situation too dangerous to indulge in. This was my boss's daughter, someone who could ruin me with a single word. But the tension that had built between us was undeniable, pulling me toward her in ways I couldn't control. Lila's hand stayed on my chest, her fingers splayed across my shirt as if she was testing my resolve. Her eyes flickered with something, desire, uncertainty, and a hint of challenge. I could feel her breath on my skin, warm and close, and my body responded before my mind could catch up. I reached out, hesitating for only a second before my hand found her waist, pulling her a step closer. She let out a small, soft breath, her body moving instinctively against mine. Her eyes locked on mine, wide and searching, and for a moment, it felt like we were both teetering on the edge of something neither of us could turn away from. I shouldn't be doing this, I muttered, but even as the words left my mouth, my hands didn't let go of her. Instead, I pulled her even closer, the warmth of her body pressing against mine, the space between us disappearing entirely. I know, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as her hand slid up to my neck. But I don't care. That was all it took. The moment those words left her lips, something inside me snapped. The last remnants of control, of logic, of restraint, all melted away. I leaned down, my lips capturing hers in a kiss that was filled with every bit of tension, every forbidden thought that had been building between us for weeks. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters, unsure of how far to go. But it didn't take long for it to deepen, for the urgency between us to explode. Her hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, her body pressing harder against mine as the kiss grew more intense. My hands roamed down her back, pulling her tighter against me, and I could feel the rapid beat of her heart through the fabric of her shirt. We stumbled backward, my back hitting the workbench as we kissed, the sound of tools clattering faintly in the background, but I barely registered it. All I could focus on was her lips on mine, her hands on my skin, the way her body fit perfectly against mine. For a moment, it felt like nothing else mattered. Not my job, not the consequences, not the fact that this was my boss's daughter. It was just the two of us, lost in the heat of the moment, the weight of what we were doing pushed aside by the overwhelming need we felt for each other. But as the kiss deepened, as our hands roamed over each other with increasing desperation, a small voice in the back of my mind began to creep in. This was wrong. This was a line I couldn't cross, a situation that could destroy everything I had worked for. But the pull between us was too strong, too intense to stop. Lila seemed to sense the hesitation in me, because she pulled back slightly, her forehead resting against mine, as we both caught our breath. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her lips swollen from the kiss, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of desire and something else, something that mirrored the conflict inside me. "This can't go further," I whispered, my voice hoarse with the effort of trying to maintain control. "We can't." "I know," she breathed, her hands still resting on my chest, her fingers tracing the lines of my shirt. But she didn't move away. She didn't let go. The silence between us was thick, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. What we both knew was still hanging in the balance. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was feeling, trying to decide whether to push her away or pull her closer. But every time I tried to think logically, the feel of her body against mine, the heat of her skin, pulled me back in. Lila's fingers slid up to my neck, her touch gentle but insistent, and she lifted her eyes to meet mine. "I don't want to stop," she whispered, her voice soft, vulnerable. I swallowed hard, my hands still resting on her waist, my heart pounding in my chest. "Neither do I." The confession hung in the air between us, and for a moment, neither of us moved. We both knew what this meant, what would happen if we didn't stop. But the pull was too strong, the tension between us too thick to ignore. And before I could stop myself, I leaned in again, capturing her lips in another kiss. This time, there was no hesitation. No holding back. The kiss was urgent, desperate, filled with all the pent-up desire that had been simmering between us for so long. Her hands roamed over my chest, my arms, pulling me closer, as if she couldn't get enough. My hands slid up her back, pulling her against me, and I could feel the heat between us growing more intense with every passing second. We stumbled again, this time toward the wall, and I pressed her back against it, my lips trailing down her neck, her soft gasps filling the small space between us. Her fingers tightened their grip in my hair, pulling me closer, and I could feel her body arching against mine, her need matching my own. The sound of our breathing filled the garage, the soft rustling of fabric as our hands explored each other, the quiet gasps and moans that escaped her lips with every touch. It was overwhelming, all-consuming, and I knew in that moment that there was no turning back. We had already crossed the line, and there was no way to undo what had been done. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our bodies trembling with the intensity of what had just happened. Lila's chest rose and fell rapidly, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of desire and guilt. I could feel the weight of what we had done settling over us, the reality of the situation crashing down around us like a tidal wave. This was a mistake, she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, though the words felt empty. We both knew it was a mistake. We both knew we had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But even as the guilt began to creep in, I couldn't shake the memory of her touch, the way her body had felt against mine, the way her lips had moved with mine. We can't let this happen again, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Lila looked up at me, her eyes filled with unshed tears. I know, but neither of us moved. We stood there, the weight of our actions pressing down on us, the tension still simmering between us, unresolved. I wanted to say something, to fix this somehow, but I didn't know how. The damage had already been done, and now we were left with the consequences. I should go, Lila whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I nodded again, but my heart ached at the thought of her leaving. I watched as she gathered herself, her movements slow and uncertain, her hands trembling as she adjusted her clothes. For a brief moment, I thought she might stay, that she might say something that would change everything. But she didn't. As she reached the door, she paused, her hand resting on the handle. She looked back at me, her eyes filled with regret, with longing. I'm sorry, she whispered, and then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood there in the silence of the garage, the air still thick with the remnants of our encounter, the guilt settling in like a heavy weight on my chest. I had no idea what would happen next, no idea how we would face each other after this. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. As I stood there in the dimly lit garage, the door shutting softly behind Lila, I felt the cold air rush in to replace the warmth of her body. My mind raced, struggling to process everything that had just happened. My pulse still pounded in my ears, my skin still tingled where her fingers had touched me, but now the heat between us was replaced by a growing sense of dread. The ramifications of what we had just done loomed over me like a storm cloud ready to burst. I ran a hand through my hair, my fingers shaking slightly. What had I been thinking? How had I let it go this far? Lila was my boss's daughter, someone I should never have gotten involved with. Not like this, not ever. I knew the lines, the boundaries that should never have been crossed, and yet, the tension between us had overwhelmed me. I moved over to the workbench and leaned against it, the solid wood offering no real comfort, but at least grounding me in something tangible. The cold of the garage felt like a splash of reality, but even that couldn't shake the memory of her lips on mine, the way her body had responded to my touch. I could still feel the ghost of her breath against my skin, the way her hands had tangled in my hair. I tried to focus on anything else, but it was impossible. The past weeks flooded my thoughts, the fleeting glances, the way our conversations had started to carry a weight they hadn't before. I had seen the signs, of course. I had felt the tension growing between us, but I had pushed it aside, told myself it was just my imagination. that I was reading too much into her smiles, the way her eyes lingered on mine a little too long. But now, after what had just happened, there was no denying it. The attraction had been there all along, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it would finally explode. I let out a long breath, my heart still pounding in my chest as the reality of the situation began to set in. What was I going to do? How was I supposed to face Mr. Langston at work after this? The thought of him finding out sent a chill down my spine. He trusted me. He'd given me this job, this opportunity. And now I had crossed a line that I could never take back. But even as the guilt weighed heavily on me, I couldn't stop thinking about Lila. About the way her lips had felt against mine, the softness of her touch, the way her eyes had looked at me with a mixture of desire and uncertainty. I knew it was wrong, but a part of me couldn't help wanting more. The connection between us hadn't been broken, it had only grown stronger, more dangerous. A sudden sound from outside pulled me from my thoughts. The faint crunch of gravel underfoot, followed by the quiet hum of a car engine. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. Mr. Langston. He must have returned from his dinner meeting. Panic flared in my chest as I glanced toward the door. What if Lila was still in the house? What if he saw her leaving the garage? The thought sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't risk him finding me like this. Not when everything was still so raw, so charged with the tension of what had just happened. I pushed myself away from the workbench and made my way toward the back door, my mind racing as I tried to figure out how to navigate the rest of the evening without arousing suspicion. I slipped out the back, careful not to make any noise, and made my way through the side yard. The cool night air felt like a slap to the face, but it did little to clear my mind. As I reached the edge of the yard, I paused, glancing back toward the garage. The lights inside had been dimmed, the house quiet. There was no sign of Lila. I breathed a sigh of relief and continued toward my car, keeping my head down as I made my way down the driveway. Once I reached my car, I slipped inside, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I sat there in the darkness, trying to steady my breathing. What was I supposed to do now? How was I supposed to act like everything was normal after this? The weight of the situation settled heavily on my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same again. The next few days at work were a blur. I kept my head down, avoiding any unnecessary conversations, especially with Mr. Langston. Every time I saw him, a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. I couldn't look him in the eye, couldn't stand the thought of what he would say, what he would do, if he ever found out about what had happened with his daughter. The guilt gnawed at me constantly, a reminder of the line I had crossed. But it wasn't just the guilt. It was something else. A lingering feeling that I couldn't quite shake. I couldn't stop thinking about Lila, about the way she had looked at me in the garage, the way her body had felt against mine. Even though I knew it was wrong, even though the guilt was suffocating, the pull I felt toward her was still there, stronger than ever. I caught glimpses of her in the office, fleeting moments where our eyes would meet across the room. She never said anything, never approached me, but there was a tension in the air whenever she was near. It was like an invisible thread that connected us, pulling us closer even when we were trying to stay apart. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk, pretending to focus on the pile of paperwork in front of me, I felt a presence behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to see Lila standing there, her expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice low enough that no one else in the office could hear. I hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "Yeah," I replied, my voice just as quiet. She motioned for me to follow her, and I stood up, my stomach twisting with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I followed her down the hallway, past the rows of cubicles and into one of the small, empty conference rooms at the end of the hall. She closed the door behind us, and the sound of the latch clicking echoed loudly in the quiet room. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched on, thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of everything that had happened between us pressing down on me. I didn't know what she was going to say, whether she wanted to apologize or confront me, or try to make sense of the mess we had created. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of guilt and longing. About what happened in the garage? My heart pounded in my chest as I stared back at her, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, I hadn't been able to stop thinking about it either. But hearing her say it out loud made the situation feel even more real, even more dangerous. I know it was wrong, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. But I can't pretend like it didn't happen. Like it didn't mean something. I swallowed hard, my mind racing as I tried to figure out how to navigate this conversation. I wanted to tell her that I felt the same way, that I couldn't stop thinking about her either. But I knew that would only make things worse. I knew that I needed to be the one to put an end to this before it spiraled out of control. Lila, I began, but she cut me off. My hands roamed up her back, pulling her tighter against me, and she responded with a soft moan, her fingers tightening their grip in my hair. The sound sent a surge of desire through me, and I kissed her harder, more urgently, as if I was trying to erase the space between us completely. I know, she said quickly, her eyes dropping to the floor. I know we can't. It's too complicated. It's a mess. But I needed to talk to you. I needed to know that I'm not the only one who feels like this. Her words hit me hard, and I felt a surge of emotion that I hadn't expected. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to tell her that she wasn't alone in this. But I couldn't. I knew that doing so would only make things more complicated, more dangerous. You're not, I admitted softly, my voice barely audible. But we can't. We can't let this happen again. The words felt hollow, even as I said them. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure I believed them. The pull between us was still there, stronger than ever, and I didn't know if I had the strength to walk away. Lila looked up at me, her eyes filled with unshed tears. I don't want to, she whispered, her voice breaking. And in that moment, I knew that I didn't want to either. The room felt smaller than it should, the air thick with the weight of her words. I could see the vulnerability in Lila's eyes, the conflict that mirrored my own. Her confession hung between us, leaving me grasping for something, anything, that could make sense of this mess. But there was nothing except the unrelenting pull between us, drawing us closer even when every logical part of me knew it was wrong. I don't want to, either, I repeated, my voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Lila took a step toward me, her movement slow and cautious, as if she wasn't sure if I'd pull away or step forward. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Her presence was overwhelming, her gaze heavy with the same forbidden desire I had tried to bury since that night in the garage. I knew we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could destroy everything if we let it, but the temptation was too strong. Her eyes searched mine, and I saw the same longing that I felt, the same confusion and guilt. But I also saw something else, something more powerful than either of us could control. I can't stop thinking about you, she confessed, her voice trembling. I've tried. I've tried to forget what happened, but I can't. I don't want to. My breath caught in my throat. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt my resolve crumbling. I should have been stronger. I should have walked away, put an end to this before it went any further. But the truth was, I didn't want to. I didn't want to stop. Not with her standing so close, her lips trembling, her eyes wide with desire. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until finally, I took a step forward. Her breath hitched, her eyes widening as I closed the distance between us. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, could hear the soft, uneven rhythm of her breathing. My hand hesitated, hovering just inches from her waist, and for a moment, I wondered if she would pull away, if she would stop this before it went any further. But she didn't. Instead, she took a small step closer, her hand reaching up to brush lightly against my arm. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, and before I could stop myself, my fingers found her waist, pulling her gently toward me. Her lips parted slightly, her breath warm against my skin as she tilted her head up, her gaze locked on mine. "What are we doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know, I admitted, my heart pounding in my chest. But I don't want to stop. Neither of us moved for a long moment. The tension between us was thick, heavy with the weight of everything we weren't saying, everything we had been denying for so long. And then, slowly, I leaned in, my lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was soft, hesitant, as if we were both testing the waters, unsure of how far this would go. Her hand slid up to my chest, her fingers curling lightly against my shirt as she kissed me back, her movements slow, deliberate. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate as the reality of what we were doing faded into the background. There was no turning back now, no stopping the pull between us. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her closer as our kiss grew more intense. Her hands tangled in my hair, her body pressing against mine with a need that mirrored my own. The heat between us was overwhelming, consuming, and for a moment, it felt like nothing else mattered. Not the consequences, not the guilt, just her. We stumbled back toward the wall, our lips never leaving each other's, and I could feel the rapid beat of her heart against my chest, could hear the soft gasps that escaped her lips between kisses. Every touch, every movement was filled with the tension that had been building between us for weeks, maybe even months. And now there was no stopping it. Her back hit the wall, and I pressed her against it, my lips trailing down her neck, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. I could feel her body arching against mine, her need as intense as my own, and I knew in that moment that we had crossed a line that could never be undone. For a long time, we stayed like that, tangled together in the small conference room, our bodies pressed close, the air around us thick with the heat of our connection. It was all-consuming, overwhelming, and yet I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. But then, just as quickly as it had started, reality came crashing back in. Lila pulled away, her breath ragged, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. Her lips were swollen from our kisses, her hair tousled, and in that moment, she looked so vulnerable, so conflicted, that my heart clenched. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. We can't keep doing this." I nodded, though every part of me ached to pull her back into my arms, to lose myself in her again. "I know." The words hung in the air between us, but neither of us moved. The guilt was already creeping in, the weight of what we had just done settling over us like a heavy fog. And yet, even as the reality of the situation pressed down on me, I couldn't shake the desire that still lingered just beneath the surface. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Lila said softly, her voice breaking. "But I don't know how to stop." I swallowed hard, my heart aching at the pain in her voice. "I don't either." We stood there in silence for a long time, the tension still thick between us, the weight of everything we had just done pressing down on us. I wanted to say something to fix this, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if it was even possible. "I should go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, but the thought of her leaving, of this ending, made my chest tighten with something I couldn't quite name. I didn't want her to go. I didn't want this to be over, even though I knew it should be. She took a small step back, her eyes never leaving mine, and I could see the conflict, the guilt, the desire all swirling together in her gaze. It mirrored everything I was feeling, everything I couldn't bring myself to say. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't be," I replied, though the words felt hollow. We both knew there was nothing to apologize for, nothing that would make this any less complicated, any less painful. Lila hesitated for a moment longer, her hand lingering on the door handle as if she wasn't sure if she could bring herself to leave. And for a brief second, I thought she might stay, that she might say something that would change everything. But then, without another word, she opened the door and slipped out into the hallway, leaving me alone in the silence of the small conference room. I stood there for a long time after she left, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a heavy stone. The guilt, the desire, the confusion, it was all too much, too overwhelming. And yet, even as I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I couldn't shake the memory of her touch, The way her body had felt against mine, the way we had both given into something we couldn't control. The pull between us was still there, lingering in the air, unresolved. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close.